Rowie, you
Yeah.
want to introduce yourself to us?
Sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Rowie. It's at Rowie Hadar on Threads. Uh, I was I only found out about the existence of the book club thanks to being quote tweeted in the Megaloo thread about it. Sorry, I still use tweeted even though we're on Threads. Uh, but yeah, I am a TV news producer in my like real life. But I
Oh,
love sports. I try to do sports when I can, uh, and I have a weird story where I am now a a Magic fan after being in a self-imposed Knicks exile from James Dolan. I grew up a diehard Knicks fan.
now
Uh,
are you the person who posted the Shattered podcast
yes,
in Threads? Oh, yeah, I listened to it today. Man, it was great. Um, I haven't. I've only listened to this episode, and I know it goes on into the Jimmy Dolan years, which sounds like a mess to listen to. But I think I'm going to try and listen to the whole thing.
Oh yeah, it definitely explains a lot of the arc of the Knicks, the like how it all went wrong from this era that Chris Herring writes about.
Yeah, it's so we're mostly Sacramento Kings fans. Well, all three of us are Sacramento Kings fans, so we definitely understand like the albatross of failure that like fans of bad teams carry with them. But the Knicks have like also that kind of the glorious past even previous to this, like with and so many I think iconic basketball players come from the New York scene, the New York situation, but also that 70s, 80s scene that he describes at the very beginning of this book, too, where they did win a couple championships and there was a great culture and it was the mecca for everybody, not just, NCAA and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, I mean, you know, so many of the books that we read like Built to Lose and stuff like that are kind of disaster narratives because it's so hard to be a success in the NBA when the only real marker of success is a championship, right? But I think this was so endearing in that it was the culture and the almost succeeding that made it such like a valuable commodity as an NBA fan. And as a Sacramento Kings fan, we totally get that because we have that 2000, there's like a little 8-year period where like Rick Adelman was our coach and we actually made it to the playoffs every year. And like all that we've really been wanting is to like get back to like mediocrity, and just not be bad anymore. So hopefully it's happening for both fan bases at this point. That's fingers crossed, anyways, right? I mean, I want everyone to win. I just want everyone to have fun. But obviously, if one team's going to win, that's not going to be possible for everyone. Um, Kev, John, do you guys want to start? Do you have thoughts, quotes?
I didn't actually take that many notes this time. I really enjoyed the book. I thought I didn't grow up during this era, so learning about this Knicks team everyone talks about was really interesting. I especially liked learning about Jeff Van Gundy because he's been a play caller, broadcaster for so long. And it's like I'm not a huge fan, but this made me appreciate him a lot more than I used to.
Yeah, a
And
lot
and
of it. Sorry.
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna comment on Jeff Van Gundy.
Yeah, and Pat Riley too. I mean, I only know him from the Miami time, but obviously, he has his Lakers and Knicks, and it's interesting to learn about that.
Yeah, well, I also didn't take many notes. I took notes initially. Like I wrote down some stuff as just stood out for me to page 91 of the paper book, and then I kind of just enjoyed the story, and
Yeah.
but So I'll get to my quotes. I think as we go through the book, as you usually go through the book, I'll get to
Okay.
my quotes. But one thing I'll say at the beginning is it's in the foreword or whatever you call it in this book. He said Horace Grant said, "When I used to walk into the garden to play the Knicks, I didn't always know if we were going to win, but I always knew we were going to bleed."
Yeah.
And that's like from an opponent, one of their hardcore rivals. That's a great way to
I
describe
keyed
this
in on
team.
that one too.
And
I mean,
in general, what?
it was such an interesting. I mean, I think like the stories of this season, as far as like narrative, have been a lot about Draymond, right? And it's like, who is he as far like I know that there's a lot of people who are like, oh, he's Dennis Rodman. But Dennis Rodman, I mean, has, I think, clinical mental health issues, right? I mean, documented ones. Like, whereas like someone like Oak or Mace, who are also celebrated for this like crazy toughness, it was more just like about being
There
the
was
bullies in a way, you know? I
there
don't
was a
know.
quote. Rasheed Wallace said that he basically grew up in that bad boys locker room. So if we're trying to point towards any kind of team or player that he resembled the most, it's someone on that bad boys Pistons team.
Yeah.
And obviously, as this book mentions, the Knicks of this era is basically a clone of those Pistons teams. So
Yeah.
there's
I
definitely a
didn't
lot of
like them. I
similarities.
really like
I,
their
I,
style.
it makes you kind of realize like that Draymond might be like a player out of place in this era. You know, in the era where
That's exactly
the
what I was going
rules
to
are
say.
changed and the standards are different. Like he would have fit right in on a team like the '90s Knicks, like you were saying, like the Bad Boys Pistons. Like I don't think like people would have just been like, "Oh, he's a tough guy." I don't know if they would have blinked as much at some of the stuff he's doing now. You know, especially thinking about like when the Knicks and the Heat had that brawl and Van Gundy was clinging on to Alonzo Mourning's leg.
Yeah.
Like, the stuff that Dre was doing, like there was somebody on the other side who was just as able to do that.
Yes.
I think my analogy I draw for Draymond is that like he's driving 90 when everyone else is driving 65. If everyone was driving 85, 80, 90, he wouldn't get pulled over. But he's driving 90 in an environment where everyone else is driving 65. He's standing out as the worst of the worst for that kind of stuff that used to be common.
Yeah.
Not common, but just not like you wouldn't go up in arms for it. It would just
I
be like,
think
oh,
for me, like the chapter in here, the enigmatic life of Anthony Mason, was so good because he does such a good job of like presenting someone like you're saying who's like literally like pedal to the metal living his life. Like he doesn't sleep, he like goes out at 3 a.m. He proposes to his girlfriend at 3 a.m. while blasting something out of his car window. Like he has kids all over the place. He's just constantly partying and yet showing up and kicking everyone's ass at practice, and on the opposing team. But then there was like this other side of like the going to the hospital and hanging out with the kids, or like showing up at his mom's house and like dropping thousands of dollars on her dresser, or like, I think it's enigmatic. Like these kind of people, like I've known a lot of people in my life who like require. I think DeMarcus Cousins, being a fan of DeMarcus Cousins for so long, was, he's pretty controversial. Like definitely has had some missteps both publicly and privately. But yet then you're like, oh, but he paid for like all these people's funerals in Sacramento. Behind the scenes, like he was doing Santa's. He was like. So there's like multiple sides to every person. And I just think it's fascinating that in sports, particularly, you may have to have this certain level of aggression, in your personality to get to like succeed in it. But then it reaches like a level where maybe you're not doing yourself any good anymore, you know? Like I think it has with Draymond. Like he's probably had to fight his ass off to get here. Like we know he had to take it personally where he was drafted. Um, you know, I don't think he had the same level of like the guys on this team, like Anthony Mason in particular, and then John Starks, those two stories of just kind of digging out of the mud and like playing all over the world and like, you know, that's really compelling, I think. And I know like in the Shattered podcast that I listened to today, they were saying like that was something that really endeared the New York fan base to these guys, is that these guys were like blue collar workers, you know, they had to like pay their dues to like even make it. And like the story about John Starks like bagging groceries, you know, like the podcast was like, did he really do that? Like that's probably totally exaggerated, but you just feel an affinity for him as somebody who's like this normal dude, you know. Um,
And it's I just want to like raise because I think about like, so just to give you a time sense, like I grew up like with the post this era Knicks, but would hear stories like my mom was the one who was first into the Knicks, and so was like when I was born was right around the middle of this era. And you know, she would tell me, or you know, the things that you watch on, you know, MSG Network, or if they talked about Starks at any point, like there were so many mentions on the broadcasts, whether like anytime there was a national game, which the Knicks had many, that you know the broadcasters would say John Starks was bagging groceries at a Safeway.
yeah, that's like the touchstone for his
Yeah,
personality.
it became one of those where it was almost like a meme just because of how often the broadcasters would bring it up. Um, I feel like there's factoids like that that broadcasts occasionally glom onto, and that was like the '90s Knicks version of that.
Well, it's so funny. I was a long time ago. I went to an Allen Iverson space on Twitter, right? And we talked. There was somebody in there who was like who was my age. I'm like 53, and so I watched this team. The reason why I'm from California, but the reason why I got to watch them so often is because they were on national TV all the time, and that was rare. Like there wasn't. It was a big market team, right? Like you didn't. I didn't see any Spurs games. I didn't see. I saw the Lakers. I saw the Knicks. Maybe Boston was thrown in there, and then there was a bunch of fun teams like Indiana was, you know, all the rivalry teams that they talk about in here. They were either they were on national TV a couple times a year, or because they made it to the playoffs, you would get to watch them early, right? On ABC. If it was ABC at the time, I don't even know that. But yeah, but what's funny for me is I remember every single game that he goes through in here, and it was kind of one of my favorite things about the book, but I also hated it in a way, just because I felt like it kind of took me outside of the narrative to a certain extent. But the thing that's funny is going back over it and like going through each one chronologically, I realized that in my memory, the entire decade was like condensed. So that like for me, if you told me that Anthony Mason and Allen Houston were not on the same Knicks team together, I wouldn't believe you. Like now I would, now I know. But like Latrell Sprewell and Doc Rivers and, you know, it all kind of globs together for me. And then Jeff Van Gundy is like the coach that I remember. Even though I must have, I think I started watching even more of the Knicks because of Pat Riley. But for whatever reason, I wouldn't have like been able to tell you that Pat Riley was, you know, that first kind of iconic coach that came in and changed the culture around and all that stuff. Um, and then that Don Nelson was like thrown in there. I don't remember that at all.
Me either, yeah.
Which I mean, that seems like kind of. I think the culture piece of this is so interesting because they kind of pitch it as like it's Pat Riley that comes in and implements this massive culture overhaul, but it's in conjunction with the front office, the Ernie Grunfeld and the Dave Checketts, right? and then the players all buy in, and then it sort of gradually diffuses out until the 2000s when everyone's gone. Basically, Ernie's fired, Dave quits, Pat's moved on. I mean, thankfully they canned Don Nelson because I think the culture would have probably died out after if there had been more Don Nelson, but the players wanted the accountability and wanted to continue that cultural touchstone that Pat Riley had implemented. I mean, tell me if I'm getting totally off base here. This is my interpretation of the story, kind of. But and over the top of it is the ownership, right? The James Dolan stuff, I think, is the shadow of doom that sort of like hangs over the badness of the team for the last, 20 whatever years.
He comes in at the end and starts to make his presence felt.
Yeah.
In a bad
For the
way.
I highly recommend the Shattered podcast. I did put it as a link at the end of my thread on Threads, or I did put it on Twitter too. And it was so good. But one of the things, they have Jeff Van Gundy on it. They go and interview like a bunch of these guys, and they had Jeff Van Gundy on it, and he says, like, he doesn't say it straight out, but he kind of says, like, once Grunfeld was gone, he only had Checketts as like a buffer between him and James Dolan. And so he knew, he was always in jeopardy anyways. He was always going to get canned anyways, but he kept like outperforming, right? But so he was saying, like, the more he had to deal personally with James Dolan, like the rougher the whole thing got. And that's what he felt like, that. And then them trading Patrick were like the two kind of harbingers of the end. Where the ownership just got too involved. And then Patrick's legacy wasn't really valued as it should have been, which I don't know. I like these kind of like iconic players that age out of their original roles, I think is such a complex issue for teams to deal with. Like, I think we're also seeing it maybe with Golden State right now, where it's like, how do you retain the legacy of like the cultural knowledge that somebody like a Clay brings, or somebody, I'm not saying Clay's career is over or anything like that. I'm not, but I am saying that guys get older and their efficacy lessens. And so, like, how should teams deal with that if they value it as like a cultural touchstone, right? And so I think that was really interesting for me. Patrick Ewing was the Knicks of this era. That's just like the other guys. I loved Marcus Camby. And he talks about in here too how, like, at the beginning of the 90s, they sort of had this like two-punch kind of offense that was like basically Patrick Ewing and John Starks. And that's all there was. There was like no real diversity. They didn't have outside shooters. It was just everyone in the lane, get it to Patrick, figure out what he can do. And otherwise, John's taking the shot, right? And so, that's sort of 90s basketball in a nutshell in some ways. Although there was way more diverse kind of teams as well. But I think as the 90s went on, and then I think, like, weirdly, that adding Don Nelson in after Pat Riley might have diversified their offense more.
Oh yeah.
Because he was so, like, he describes him as like a mad scientist and wanting to run things through Anthony Mason, and wanting to run things through a forward instead of from the point guard position. And Don Nelson was a visionary, right? I think you can make the argument that he wasn't great with people, or at least this book makes that argument. Or at least he didn't enforce like the cultural kind of makeup that they had built with Pat. So I don't think he ever gained trust from the players, right?
It seemed like he didn't try to set his own culture. Like, that this is our culture. He said, like, this is a veteran team. You know, it was in there's like it's a bunch of vets, and we're gonna just like implement this stuff, and we're gonna practice less. And he didn't try.
Yeah.
It didn't seem to me, you know, that based on the book that he tried to, like, you know, create his own, like, oh, we're gonna shift now, guys, and we're gonna be more like this. It seemed like it was just like, let's just roll the ball out there. Let's do our little offensive diagramming, and let's practice
Yeah.
less. Let's have Mason be the point forward, and just good. Let's go, guys. Let's do it. And
Right.
they didn't buy in yet. They hadn't bought in yet. So
I think to a certain extent too, like maybe I think Don Nelson's image may be different now too, because after this he went on to have other incredibly potent offensive teams, right? Not only that, but now he's like some Hawaiian pot salesman dude who, like, basically whenever they go and interview him, he's just high as a kite, hilarious. So I think in some ways, like, the player problems that he had, I mean, we know he had problems with Chris Webber. He had other problems in his coaching career making, you know, with the player relationships. And I don't know enough about it. I just remember that being one of the talking points against him. But then his tenure, like in Dallas, was incredible, right? Where people bought into him making his whole new system. So maybe, in the long run, these kind of foibles and mistakes of like hiring him, it not working out, maybe that benefited their offense. Maybe, and especially since Jeff was still an assistant coach under him. So Jeff could take the things that worked like from both places and kind of try and incorporate them. And as he got different people like Marcus Camby, Allen Houston, and Latrell, they were able to expand, especially they were able to expand the space on the floor. Allen Houston and Marcus Camby were both good three-point shooters for the time. And then I think 94, 95 was when they moved that three-point line in, right? So anyways.
Oh,
you know what?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So I was just gonna say, you know, I think actually maybe you can cut this, Megan. I forgot what I was gonna say. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I had to go back and look because I wasn't sure if it was in this book or in Shattered, but it is in Herring's book in the Nelson section when he's talking about when Herring's writing about the trade offers that Nelson was that were rumbling in the Nelson era. And it's so interesting to the point of like thinking about the Knicks offense changing, like how generational it would have been if either of these went through. Before I get to them, I still find it crazy when I hear about like NBA rumors from like 30 years ago and that they're just published in the newspaper. Like I'm a Georgetown alum, and I remember seeing a newspaper clipping from the mid to late '90s where it just shows up in like page 15 of the sports section somewhere, and it's like, oh, the LA Clippers interviewed John Thompson for their coaching job, and it feels like the sort of thing that now like Woj and Shams would have everywhere. ESPN would have 3 days of First Take about it.
Yeah.
You look at like the ridiculous level of trade talks here. That it happened to get out into the papers that New York was looking to move like a few of those role player guys. They have Oakley, Mason, Starks, and Smith. I'm assuming Charles Smith for Alonzo Mourning, like 2 or 3 years in. And then you have Nelson being screwed because the organization wasn't ready to make a trade of Ewing for a 10 years younger Shaq to give him a head start in New York so that they can sell him on staying. Taking on Shaq as an expiring contract to get a head start from Orlando to make sure he didn't sign with like the Lakers or anybody. And just thinking about like how like the team would have looked so different with it running through Shaq or Ewing instead of through Ewing. Like it feels like such a turning point that they said, all right, we're going to keep this culture that has worked for us well, but can't beat the Bulls instead of taking like a big risk, like trading for Shaq.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of like it's interesting. Like, I don't think, I mean, basketball didn't change a ton in this 10 years, right? But it did start gravitating further and further towards the 3-point line. And part of that gravitation was when they moved the line in. And so guys started making more of those shots. They started practicing that shot more, and then they moved it back out, I think 2 years later, right? um but in a sense, like, that's kind of looking at and understanding how the role players changed over that time, and going from like Oak and Mace to Houston and Camby. That's where you see it, right? Where all of a sudden they added offense, they added shooting. And even like they said, Jeff Van Gundy was like distraught when they traded Oak, right? But they just weren't, I mean, but then having Marcus Camby come in, and then Marcus Camby like had so many legendary nights where he just saved their butts with like extreme shooting. Marcus Camby is one of my favorite players of all time. I was actually surprised. I remember there being like a lot of scuttlebutt at the time that he was sort of like a pot smoker, like lazy dude kind of guy. And I think that was probably worse because he went to New York where there's such this huge media market, and they're gonna like you said, they're gonna like scuttlebutt everything in the newspaper. But anyways, yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating. It was just a really good book, in my opinion, and it really resonated because, like I said, I had watched almost all of these games. I think there was one game that I didn't remember, but as he was going down like the game breakdowns at the end of the series, I was like, oh, I remember. Oh, like and some of it's just so iconic. Like, even if you didn't see the game at the time, about it, like the Spike Reggie thing. I feel like every basketball fan kind of knows that to a certain extent, that Spike and Reggie, that Spike was like harassing Reggie, and then Reggie just kept making shot after shot after shot. It's um, just very cool, very like memeable moments of basketball. Um, yeah. I just listed out like all this stuff here. So the Pat Riley, Don Nelson, the front office. I think the ownership groups changing was probably the biggest kind of impact. Even though from Paramount to Cablevision, it didn't change significantly. But bringing in James Dolan was like, again, kind of. I mean, I think most Knicks fans view that as the nail in the coffin. Until this last couple years of success under Thibodeau. But you could argue that Thibodeau is trying to rebuild kind of the same Knicks culture that existed under Riley, right? Like, he does two-a-days. He like plays his guys 40 minutes a game. He's like, I mean, they're not. I don't think you think you're gonna bleed when you go to New York, but you're gonna have to fight through a bunch of dudes who are going to play hard
You
defense.
mentioned in this book that Thibs I think he was an assistant to Van Gundy. So.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
I remember like when you'd see the old Knicks intros after they introduced Van Gundy, you would hear, assistant coaches are Tom Thibodeau. So yes.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. So, I mean, so he's bringing it back, right? I mean, and I think to a certain extent, again, like bringing in my Kings fandom, I think Monty is trying to bring back the Adelman era in the team that he's built, and how he's built it. Like, you can kind of see like how he's getting the pieces and how the pieces fit and how they mirror the pieces from that old team. I don't know if there's like necessarily a Mace or an Oak on this Knicks team now, but you could say, there's a lot of Allen Houston's.
I find it like it's really interesting how strongman ownership can really just destroy a team in a second. Them having to trade Oakley for and then firing the GM and the coach, and yeah, it's crazy how much ownership really just throws a wrench on a team. Like, yeah, this team was great, and it was kind of blown up almost instantly
Yeah.
because of Dolan, and we've experienced heavy-handed ownership too.
Yes.
So yeah, ownership is a surprisingly annoying.
Well, and we have Miami to look at and compare to what, like, Miami is Pat Riley's baby, right? Miami is the culture. Like, they even wrote that on their court without centering the goddamn font, which is a crime.
Miami is almost like the Knicks counterfactual. Like, we actually get the what if.
Yes.
Yeah.
Totally. And even with the morning, I mean, that Miami team and the rivalry between New York and Miami at the time was like the hottest shit on the plate. Like, it was so fun. There was always going to be a fight. Jeff Van Gundy would always be at the bottom of the dog pile, like, and come up with his hair all messed up, like,
in the 70 wins.
just absolutely insane. I mean, and Alonzo Mourning was such a good, foil to Patrick Ewing, and everything about it was so compelling. But I think it's so interesting too that, like, they talk a lot about like little kind of actions. I mean, maybe it's not a little action to require them to fire Grunfeld or Ben Gundy, right? Where James Dolan said one of them's got to go. But then then that implemented Checkett's leaving later on, because he was like, that never should have happened. And I'm not in anymore. I'm not all in. But also the whole thing about like the bill from the Reno trip when they stopped in Reno.
Yeah, that Reno trip is one of the funniest stories. You would have never known about that unless you read a book like this. But
and then Riley like being pissed about that not paying him back, like for like $10,000, which is probably nothing to him, right? But just the fact that they didn't reimburse him, like, was like, just simmering under the surface, like, so they couldn't like let him into like the ownership share because of the way it was structured, and then plus they hadn't paid him back for this gambling bill, which, like, should he really have gotten paid back for? I don't know.
Yeah, but they promised him, and that's what matters.
Yeah.
And then John Starks didn't see his hotel room the whole night time he was in Reno.
It's so funny.
He was at the craps table or wherever he was at, winning and losing.
I feel like Jalen Brunson is a very Starksy kind of player too. No, I mean, he's obviously has way better efficiency, but to me, he's kind of like in that same mold of like that small, fun, shit kicker guard,
It's actually really funny to bring in my modern day Magic fandom to see Cole Anthony feels like he's very much in the John Starks mold, complete with the inefficiency too.
Yes.
And it's wild to think that he would be the person to do that, considering his dad being a part of those 90s Knicks teams, Greg, and arguably, like, I mean, he was like Starks' backup at that point too.
Is Cole Greg's son?
Yes.
Oh my God, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he is very, like, that's one of the things that made me feel at home watching them, is like, at least him and until recently Bamba being a New York kid, like, they felt like they had a lot of like Knicks South energy.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, I think like this year's Magic is a really good kind of example of like where they're trying to build and implement this like fairly hardcore defensive minded culture. I just watched them today, and today's game was like the more bummer game that I've watched of them, but they just, because they don't have Franz and they don't have Joe, so they didn't have any shooting really except for Paolo. But yeah, I mean, where they're putting together just all these kind of shitbird guys. And like, I mean, Suggs too has been so good this year. Like, that totally took me by surprise. That's not
And
somebody I
I
expected.
didn't know he was. I didn't think he was necessarily going to find that level in the pros.
Yeah.
It is so interesting though that culture feels like the running theme here. Like I think about it even with you guys in Sacramento, seeing like the fan culture, the team culture, everything feels like it's building finally and moving, and like it like even with the Knicks the last few years, like we're seeing the same sort of thing happen. Fans are coming back; they're paying attention. Uh, I feel like like you can see it even with like those. I don't know how familiar you guys are with those side talk videos of the fans outside MSG. It's where the whole Bing Bong thing came
Oh
from.
yeah.
Yeah, those are delightful.
And that being away from New York, like that is the like best reminder to me that like of how wonderful Nick and crazy Knicks fans are.
Yeah.
That they are so ready for a winner. And they have like that Lakers sized culture, but with no winning to point to in their lifetimes. It's like if Lakers fans had the Kings.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if the Lakers were the Clippers, right?
Yep.
Well, I mean, maybe not the Clippers. I mean, the Clippers, my God, the Clippers are going to like win the whole thing this year, and everybody's going to be like, oh, meh. Okay.
Before we get off this topic, can I share my screen?
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that on this platform,
It
but
should be down here in like, do you have a remote in the corner?
yeah, I do. Yeah.
And then there should be like a
Okay.
screen share right there.
I can share YouTube. That's what I'm going to, but I'll share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Whoops, that's not what I want to do. Wrong button. My bad. Okay. And it's gonna. Oh, here we go. I get to share my window. Nice. All right. So.
Oh. I decided last time to make a Murray graphic, right? So every time he made a three, I was sharing it. So it was just like a Keegan. But it was like taking up the entirety of my whole freaking screen. Like I couldn't keep up. He was making them so fast.
Okay.
I
stopped sharing my screen. I don't know if you guys saw what I was sharing, but I'm seeing
that Keegan Murray.
Oh, you see Murray? Oh.
I've seen a lot of Keegan Murray threes.
Sorry, my bad. I don't know. I never shared my screen in this thing before, so let me try
from the Iowa Hawkeyes School of 3-point shooting.
Yes.
Okay, my bad. Do you see a Knicks guy looking pretty angry but hot fired up right now? Some Knicks fans.
Oh yeah.
Okay. But we have the Knicks. New York Knicks run New York City. KD, don't you regret not coming to the Knicks? Don't you regret not coming to the Knicks? Let's go Knicks. Let's go Knicks.
Okay, that's enough.
Oh my God, so good.
So
good.
Yeah, so the original channel that did that is
show them
Side Talk.
show them Tom Brady.
Oh yeah,
That's my favorite guy.
Okay, I'm done.
So funny.
Your,
my favorite is the KD. Don't you regret not coming to the Knicks?
Also, the guy who you showed, the angry guy, is great because he brings it back to politics. And he's like the angry guy. He's like, we had De Blasio, we had Cuomo. It was rough shit, but at least we have the Knicks. and I think the first time I saw that, like, I got off my couch and started like running across the room laughing.
Oh my God, that's so funny. I found the. I wonder if I can. Let me see here. I found the New York Knicks song that he talks about how one of the janitors
You gotta play this. I probably like ran out the tape or the broke or like made the CD full of scratches playing this.
It's so good. Oh,
New York Knicks. We are the New York Knicks. We are the New York Knicks. Say go New York, go New York, go. Go New York, go New York, go. Say go New York.
To me, it's so funny that people would wear their ties and their suit jackets when they're in the game, when they're at the NBA game.
With Hubert, Bonner, Greg, and Harper, it's the Knicks, and we're back on pace. Everyone's gearing up for the championship race, and the fans are going crazy, and they're doing it for a reason. Because 94 is the Knickerbocker season.
the Knickerbocker season.
Shoot 3-pointers, and we're running fast breaks, and if your defense makes a mistake, then bam, Ewing dunks in your face. This is a team you don't want to miss. We are New York. We are the New York Knicks. Go New York, go New York, go.
I'm sure it's better if you actually go to YouTube. This is like the clip.
Say go New York, go New York, go.
So good.
So yo, bust it. All you hear is a swish. Threes by Starks and dunks.
I looked up like the origins of that song further, and those guys that wrote that song, they were like the janitors at Madison Square Garden, or what, the guy was like the janitor, and he ended up getting hired to write songs for like a bunch of teams in the 90s that were like kind of loosely based on that, and basically he's like a millionaire now.
Yeah, they're
writing sports
There's
go
a-
songs.
There's a Bullets version, I know for sure.
Oh man.
And I know that he married the lady who created Spanx.
Oh.
So that's how he has all the money, and now he's an owner of the Hawks.
Oh my God, that is freaking insane. I'm gonna have to dig that out and make a chronological timeline of his life, maybe. How hilarious is that? Okay. I don't know. I like randomly pulled a bunch of quotes, but I don't really they're just kind of like explicative of like the culture they were building. Like like what we've already talked about, like the Riley shoot arounds often went 2 hours and were full contact. And then this is about Anthony Mason right here. The strong effort stemmed from fear of losing his spot.
I think it's just incredible how much Pat Riley kind of built like almost a cult of personality, like a persona that was like untouchable. He obviously he had his time in the Lakers, but like when he went to the Knicks, he was basically like God Emperor, or like this untouchable. Like the way he coached, he was like hot shit. The he always dressed up in this fancy suits and ran his team in grass super hard.
There's all these accounts, like there's a bunch of accounts on Threads that are called like Armani Hoops, or like I don't know, are they referring to, I mean, because he was famous for wearing Armani suits, right?
Yeah.
And he had like that written into his contract that Armani was going to dress him and all this stuff. So I don't always know if they're referring to Pat Riley, or like there's one called Armani Mafia, Armani Mafia Hoops, I think, something like that, or if they're referring to Booker. So I don't know. Anyways,
I mean, yeah. So I mean, he basically made himself the class of the NBA.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how he's basically kept that, like building that atmosphere, and always throughout all these years kept that class of the NBA throughout. I think that's incredible.
Well, and that Miami has been, I'm not a Miami fan, so don't quote me on this, but I mean, the fact that they made it to the finals last year with basically like just people they found in the scrap heap, and Jimmy, like, it's like, well, I mean, Bam and Jimmy and everyone else, like, it's insane, like, but that the culture has maintained. I mean, you see where like the Knicks kind of fell off the cliff in the 2000s, right? And then obviously we have the the Wade. We have the championship even before LeBron got there. That was with Shaq and Wade and Bosh and stuff. And then LeBron came, and did they win 2 more with them?
Yeah, it was 2, I think.
I think that was 2. So in the 2000s, the Heat were like riding that shit to infinity and beyond. Obviously, they brought in stars, more stars than they do now. Like, to me, that's a part of the culture. Is you're going to outwork everybody, right? Or at least try. and it's been successful for them long term now. So if we're saying Riley went there in 95, we're talking about almost 30 years of like basketball kind of, greatness, really. I mean, at least being at a level that the Knicks were at, that the fans were like super excited about,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, absolutely incredible. I thought it's interesting that they talk a little bit too about Riley's dad being a professional ball player, and then when his career ended, it was pretty, like went kind of straight to depression of like, what now? And I think that's probably more common than is talked about for professional athletes is that what now? I mean, maybe there's more options now than there was in the past to do podcasting and commentary and all that stuff. And maybe people talk more about mental health, but I do see like having a career like that ends so early in your life, and you're making so much money and you're like a hero, and everybody knows your name and all this stuff is like, and then all of a sudden it's like nothing. The faucet just cuts off. It must be a crazy like mental health journey to get yourself right. And I thought it's interesting that Chris Herring notes that like Pat was always scared of like that drop off after his career ended, which is kind of what got him back into it. And then Chick Hearn being such like a proponent of his and like helping him find his way back in. And then it was just like coincidence. So much of like all of these stories that we've read, or it's just like the opportunity a lot of the time for a lot of people just seems like coincidence, right? Like, oh yeah, I was looking for someone and he was right there. Like, it's just crazy. Like, I mean, the way that the whole Lakers coaching thing happened in the Showtime era is just nutty opportunity for Riley. And then he happened to turn it into this 40-year long, massively impactful basketball career. Absolutely insane.
Yeah, he
was
Riley's
funny.
dad.
McDaniel was one of my favorite Sonics of all time. But this story about him walking around the locker room with towels on his dick cracked me up.
Also, sorry to jump in before you're transitioning here.
No, not at all.
But just for X, I feel like he feels almost like a perfected like Draymond Green type in terms of the mindset. Like,
that's such a good call.
No pun intended, saying cocky, but like brash and like there. I was looking back because I thought I saw something about X in there, and I saw there was a quote about Riley telling him to be the Seattle version of himself because he was being hesitant, and to get him like pissed off and like more physical in the game, and then you got him doing exactly that to Pippen and Jordan in that one playoff series. It's so interesting to see what happens when you have that crazy streak, but it's like harnessed or like selectively deployed rather than deployed aimlessly.
Right. And I don't know what happened. I can't say that I know what happened to Xavier once he left the Knicks. The story about him leaving was kind of a bummer. Like, he just didn't understand the way bird rights worked, and they didn't really explain it to him very well. So he thought they were basically like overlooking him when they were just waiting to sign him last because they had bird rights on him. which I mean, it ended up working out okay for the Knicks, but I don't know what happened to him after that at all.
Did they
And
not have what's it called, those salary things, cap holds back then? Was that part of the CBA?
Yeah,
back then?
they had bird rights on Xavier.
I know they had bird rights, but did they have cap holds so that, like, you know, what they were trying to do a maneuver that, like, I don't think you can do that these days. Like, it doesn't matter because
I don't know. I pulled up. I don't think I can share it.
well, let's
but
not get into that. Never mind. I
yeah,
was just when someone new.
it
I don't
gets
want
into
to. I
the
don't want to
weeds
research it
pretty
right
easily.
now.
There is
Yeah.
like if you go to what's the good salary
CBA
page that
FAQ.
Keith Smith does?
Oh, CBA FAQ.
No, the God damn it, it's gonna kill me if I don't remember it now. Let me see here.
It just confused me a little bit when that they were like
It
trying to
sounded to
wait.
me. I mean, the book makes it seem like they just didn't communicate with him.
Yeah,
Like,
for sure.
like where he's like, why aren't they talking to me? Like, why aren't they signing me? Why aren't they making me this offer? And really what they were trying to do was get all the other ducks in a row so they could go back to him and give him the max money they could give him. But okay, so so we're like at an hour, so I'm going to try and speed through some of this stuff. I think we've covered a ton already. I think it was interesting. It talked about Oakley playing football and like learning to really love like physical contact in the context of football, which I think there's like this narrative right now about everybody playing youth basketball and not diversifying in sports, and like what effect does that have on your body as far as injury. But I think it's also interesting to look at it in this context of like what effect does that have on your mentality in the game, right? Where like Oak actually like learned to actually love being in the midst of that punishing kind of physicality, and he brought it to basketball, And I mean, there's some guys like that in the league now, a few maybe. But he was so outrageous. Like he would this quote, that play was so physical, the refs had no idea what to do. He recalls, right then I told myself this summer I'm getting two guys just like Oak. And I mean, I think like we had Meta here, who was similar to this. It was like, is he fucking batshit or is he really effective? Like he just loves like stirring the shit, right? But he's really goddamn good at it. Like, and I'm pretty sure that he was the guy that the Indiana GM went out and got in response to Oakley kicking the shit out of them and not getting called for it. Let's see here. And then this was like, they talked a lot about like the rules that they made. There weren't as many as I thought, but they talked about the rules that were made that either like used Knicks players as like the poster kids for the rules. And one of them was the hand checking rule. And then this one, the player leaving the bench during the altercation was in response to that Miami kerfuffle, fracas. And then the hand checking too. So that's kind of cool. And then like I had said before, I think that also necessitated like kind of a roster change up in the sense that like they needed more outside shooting instead of like all of this interior physicality that they had with Oak and Mace. Sorry, let's see. Yeah, and then they're just like how much they loved Van Gundy. Like it's so funny because I think like some people, like we talk about Riley's legacy, right? So Riley is completely iconic. Like he is the culture. He is Miami. He, like I said, it's like 40 years of this completely successful coaching / personnel management, culture, but then you have someone like Jeff Van Gundy who had this really solid run as a coach here, who like overcame all of these times that they were like, oh, he's going to get fired, he's going to get fired, he's going to get fired. And then plus having like the huge market newspapers. And as dumb as it sounds, like newspapers, like reading sports news in a newspaper used to also be a huge deal. I know Twitter and Threads and all this stuff make it like an instant kind of like push notification that everybody's going to freak out about, right? But reading the paper, like for my dad's 90 something. For him, reading the paper, he would read the paper and then he'd go talk to all his friends about it. So in a huge market like New York, I think everything was under a massive magnifying glass. I mean, and it talks about that to an extent with their like personal foibles of how many kids they had, and Patrick Ewing breaking up with his wife and his wife writing a book and all that stuff. But anyways, so what I was trying to say was that Van Gundy's, I think, legacy has been mildly tarnished because of his broadcasting career. And same with Reggie Miller. Like, I'm kind of a Reggie Miller defender to a certain extent, where like the people who didn't see his playing career, or for Van Gundy, the people who didn't see his coaching career here or with Houston, I don't think know like how revered he was by his players, like what a great coach he was. Like he really did save some of these series from being over sooner than they were. It was because of coaching, and he maintained the culture in the places that he went. And he's really a smart basketball mind. But if you just sat and listened to his broadcasts, I don't know that that's the takeaway you're having. You know what I mean? Like him and Mark Jackson would just go off on these weird tangents, some of which were hilarious, but some of which were like, what are you even talking about? It's the middle of a basketball game. But anyways.
I can remember like even being a kid and like fans loved Van Gundy.
Yeah.
Like they talk about in the book, and I think this was also in the podcast too, but they talk about Van Gundy as like a grunt worker, like that he, like this like played D3 and was like worked his way like by being like willing to scout and to stay in the video room late. And it's so interesting to see him like he's basically, if we're doing the Heat are Pat Riley's alternate universe Knicks, he is the Knicks alternate universe Spo. Like Spoelstra had exactly the same kind of story, like playing like not going to be a pro at all, and then just worked his way in as a guy who would stay all night and watch all the tapes, and
being that rebound machine and the film room addict. Yeah. And part of it for me, when I was watching this team, well, I was probably 20, right? But his appearance, like he just has these he looks like a freaking accountant, first of all. His hair was always fucked up, and he has these massive bags under his eyes all the time. And he literally would be like the first guy at the bottom of the dog pile. Like he was just as tough as his players, but he looks like he should have a pocket protector, like. And so I totally get like loving him. I think he's such a great coach. I know that like I've heard a lot of podcasts, and the Shattered podcast has him in it, which is great. But I've heard a lot of podcasts of former players of his who credit him with just like telling them exactly what he needs from them. Like he's like, I need this many rebounds from you tonight, just being extremely explicit and simple. And anyways, and I think going, like Patrick like made a huge push for him to not be the one that was fired. and then it's just funny because they were like in this period of like I would consider the Jeff Van Gundy period to be just as compelling as the Riley period was, with Spree, with Camby, with Houston. And then they were kind of like beset, by injury, age. But he sort of tells the background story on like the John Starks Game 7 meltdown, where they had somebody who could have come in as a backup, but they didn't put him in, because he had like Riley didn't put him in because he had some like he wanted to bring wives on the trip or something. And so he just let John Starks out there like hang himself basically, even though anyways, so and then this was the end is even if the story didn't have a happy ending, it's one nearly all the players and their millions of fans have longed for a team like that ever since, and they would gladly relive it. And that again, like that resonated so much because you go back to the 2000 Kings, and that's it. We don't have to win everything, but that it's still like the glory days of the franchise, right?
It's still sad for me though. Both Dunny mentioned the Kings. It's a good comparison, but like it's still pretty sad for me that they ran into Tim Duncan, and in the year that they were probably could have won it, that was the year they had the big suspension thing going on, right?
Yeah, and they had Ewing hurt too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Ewing was hurt for the second one as well.
And Larry Johnson already was having his back issues pop up.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, Larry Johnson too is such an underrated part of those Knicks teams. Like he was one of my all-time favorite players in Charlotte. And then he was probably okay, so he gives like the character studies of Mace, Oak, Ewing, Starks, and Johnson, right? And maybe he does a couple others. He does like the butterfly and the bowl kind of one where it's like where the culture takes a toll on some of these guys that weren't as didn't buy in as much, and maybe destroyed them to a certain extent, which is also worth thinking and talking about, which is I think a part of the reason why basketball culture as a whole has changed to become hopefully a more I don't know, a less bully, like macho. I want to say macho, but it's more like a toxic kind of masculinity where it's like, it's like I'm I don't know. That's complicated. I probably shouldn't speak on it since I'm not even a dude. But where was I going? Oh, Larry Johnson. And the story about him doing the Grandmama commercials I thought was so cool. And then that they really painted him as he was just a good guy. Like, whereas all these other guys sort of had this really complex kind of character makeup where they had these, really hardcore. I mean, Anthony Mason probably to the extreme of, or like Oakley with his gambling. Where they were just such bad boys, but then they had sort of good sides. But Larry Johnson was just a good guy who was funny and like who embraced doing this crazy shit. Like who would have dressed, cross-dressed as a grandma? Like that's insane. But it was so funny and so successful and so iconic for that time. But he's not a standout player in my memory of the Knicks, but he was so fantastic in that whole era of basketball.
I want to share that I don't know how to put it really, but I kind of feel like Ewing is in both teams, but the Ewing, Starks, Mason, and Oakley, and I don't know if anyone else I would put in there, but like those guys, the analogy or the simile I would draw would be like those guys are like Van Halen when they had David Lee Roth, and then after that it's like when they had Van Halen with the other guy, Sammy Hagar. It's like it's the same similar team, but it's just not the same. But just for me, I'm not a Knicks fan, but like Johnson, especially Sprewell, who's good, but like who came on there towards the end and just kind of was attached on there and to help get them to the finals, of course, obviously. But like, it just feels different to me than the first set of guys.
I think Sprewell is like sort of a complicated story again because he sort of outlasted everyone else too. So he was like the face of the team as it got worse and worse and worse, right? So even though he was like a part of the Van Gundy team, once Van Gundy left, Sprewell stayed for a number of years and was sort of the face of the franchise, for better or worse.
Him and Allen Houston too. Like everybody, like Houston, I might have even stayed longer. Like it's amazing that there is still these links. There were still these links. Like I remember growing up and being like, these links to these when I was a little kid are still like tied to the Knicks.
Yeah. I can't even imagine growing up in New York. It must be so pervasive. Well, and Camby went to the Nuggets, but I don't like it was the Carmelo Nuggets. Camby was there before Carmelo got there. I can't say what exact year that was, but so I don't know if he was as much of like the face of failure as Latrell was. I don't know. I just pulled some of the pictures that this one actually wasn't in the book. I just pulled this one because it's McDaniels and MJ. That just is like seems like such a 90s kind of image to me of like this, and then this is Checketts and Riley. There's Oak, Mace, and Riley. He looks like a proud dad, doesn't he? And then Patrick. I mean, it is a tragedy in some ways that I think there was a bunch of teams in this era that never got past Michael, and even though they weren't like facing Michael every single time, it was still like the Bulls were the shit in the 90s. But so many other great teams. And I love that he went through all the different like rivalries because Indiana was so fun. Miami was so fun. I actually love the Hawks team. The Dominique Wilkins Hawks team was so fun of this era too. And that's probably all I have. Let me see here.
It's just so much fun to root for teams that have an identity. Like in every era, there's always going to be teams that don't make it, right? Because 30 teams, only one can win. And it's like, but that doesn't mean other teams can't be celebrated. And learning about this Knicks team, learning about why everyone appreciated it so much, and just appreciating the identity they built, the blood in the garden, the Knicks, the tough guy Knicks. It's fun, and it's just such a nice experience to go through these teams that you wouldn't otherwise, because they're not the number one, they're not the they don't get as much flowers as they deserve, but they're great teams nonetheless, and they should be celebrated anyways.
I'm waiting for the Kings book from the J. Will C. Webb era. I feel like they're the next team to deserve the 90s Knicks style treatment here if we're moving through the years.
Yeah. Because we had Jerry Reynolds' book, which went up right before that, I believe. But there's not really a book of that era. Actually, I think Jerry Reynolds' book mostly it stops like when they start sucking.
Yeah.
It's,
I think is around that time.
Chris Herring last year, when the Kings when they implemented the beam and they hired Mike Brown, Chris Herring, who wrote this book, was here, and he went on D-Lo and KC, which is like a YouTube radio show here, a local radio show. And he said the reason why he was here is because he was interested in documenting like rise, right? The come up.
Yeah, the come up's always the best part.
Yeah. And so I don't know if that's gone anywhere or what he had he basically said that like to write a book like this you have to have someone to pay you to do it, right? Or obviously the unpaid time to do it. And he didn't have that when he went on the radio to talk about it. But who knows? I mean, especially depending on how this year shakes out, right? I think we could see more. Also, we could probably write it at this point. I mean, we've done a lot of like we read Jerry Reynolds' book, and then we read Pete Carrill's book, which Pete Carrill doesn't talk about his time in Sacramento, but I think he was pivotal in implementing the basketball culture that they were trying to promote, during the 2000s. He was sort of like the Tex Winter of the Kings. So, yeah, I was totally thinking that when I was listening to Shattered, too, is that even if we didn't write a book, we could do a History of the Kings podcast, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of source material that you can dig up that is pretty interesting. I think it's interesting even why they moved to Sacramento, and that they were going back and forth between Omaha and Kansas City, and they didn't have sponsors. And, when they came here, they literally came to a freaking barn. Like, but yeah.
Oh.
Any last thoughts on this sucker?
I thought this was really, really fun to read through. It was very entertaining. It was very engaging, compelling. The way it was written is very, interesting. Page turner. I got through this quicker than most of our books.
Yeah.
And I was really glad we read through it because it's nice to appreciate these good teams that don't get so good.
I think it's great how applicable narratives are, even narratives of mediocrity or disaster, how applicable they are to like the entire timeline of basketball or to like different teams. And then everyone's sort of like interconnected personnel wise. So like you can trace all of these different people from organizations to their next organizations and stuff like that. And then the philosophy parts of it continue, right? I mean, the most obvious one obviously is Pop at this point. But pre-Pop, there's Riley. I don't know that Riley has a coaching tree per se, or that Van Gundy does either. But there was something pre-Pop, that was about having this kind of like hardcore culture. I think there was sort of an opposite philosophical culture with like Doug Moe or something like that. Like someone who's just preaching like all offense, which is more like, like a Doug Moe, George Karl kind of ram it down your throat offense, which is interestingly kind of what like Carlisle's doing this year, which will be, interesting to see how that all pans out. But great book, great narrative. Enjoyed. John, any last thoughts?
My last thoughts were like, it was a little bit sad that Ewing went out at the end. This whole thing, the whole story. I guess, yeah. You don't have to be able to be a good team. Obviously, I'm glad they wrote the book. I'm glad Harry wrote the book. They were worthy of a book for sure. But yeah, Jordan was a buzzsaw for a lot of people, and then he was gone, or he came back, and wasn't as good for the last third of that season. So I think the Magic bounced him, but that year. But yeah, it's just it's too bad. That's all.
Well, and I think the end of Patrick's career, I had it on my slides too, like the end of Patrick's career where he went to the Sonics and he was pretty okay. So again, like I keep referring to the Shattered podcast, and it's only an hour, like the episode that directly relates to this team. I highly recommend going to listen to it. It's in my thread thing, but it talks about how Patrick asked for the trade. He was the one that asked to be traded, and then there was a lot of second guessing about that he should have been somehow, they should have figured out how he could have stayed at the Knicks in a different role, or like etc. But yeah, so the last part of his career was pretty sad. And then I think in Sacramento, for me, I have that picture of him in the airport like leaving the coaching interview. You know what I mean? Like, and I think like as a coach, he never really got. I mean, now the end of this, it covers his Georgetown victory. And I don't know if he's still the coach of Georgetown. I think that was like a couple years ago that they won.
He
But he never really got a chance in the NBA as a head coach. I think that Van Gundy's both like really promoted him and talked really highly of him. And I know at the time there was a lot of conversation about the fact that like big men weren't considered good tacticians of basketball, right? Not like point guards were. So in terms of coaching, like the likelihood of former players being hired would be a lot more of like a point guard kind of situation. Um, but I mean, he's a really smart man, and he does really know the game. And it's just time like adds so much to the legacies of these guys. Like, I just or like there's the little clip of him like, did you practice that shot? Why'd you take that shot? Did you practice that shot? Like,
oh
but, uh, yeah, he was just such an iconic figure of 90s basketball and an incredible player. I mean, I think it's overshadowed by how run down his body. Like when he was on the Seattle bench, you could barely see him. He was wrapped in so much fucking ice. Like he had ice like on his knees, like the ice packs were like this thick, like, and it was sad, but yeah.
to the Ewing point, I love that you brought it up because I was thinking the same thing as like the full circle that I got to see a lot as a Georgetown alum of Ewing as a coach.
Yeah.
And I like they loved telling you on broadcasts and stuff that he was a product of the Van Gundy coaching tree. I had to go back
Oh,
and look it up, but his like other than a like the stint where he really like formed as an um, formed as a coach was under the Van Gundys. Like he was under Jeff in Houston, Stan in Orlando,
yeah.
and Steve Clifford, who I believe is also a Van Gundy coaching tree
Oh,
product in
interesting.
Charlotte. So, and then when he came back to Georgetown, it was seen as like the the prodigal son returning, and you got all that national media attention. Um, he had that attitude. I remember watching that game with the do you work on that shot? The clip of him chewing out. That was actually an insane game because he chewed out Marcus Derrickson, who I believe had a couple of cups of coffee in the NBA. And that was the game where Derrickson's whole career turned around. Like he turned around in the second half of that game, and then he worked up into G League and Summer League conversations. And it's hard not to think that it was Ewing who was able to get a guy like that from just sort of flaming out to like that sort of NBA periphery. Um, the
That's
the
funny.
tournament win was insane, but then in true sad Knicks fashion, he had two more seasons and he won a grand total of two in conference games,
Oh no.
including one season where he went over in.
Oh no. So
Uh,
he's not the coach there anymore.
he is no longer the coach. Ed
I
Cooley, formerly of Providence, is now the coach.
Oh,
But it's a very like it's a very fitting like he has this moment, he's the guy, and then it just fizzles out.
yeah.
And completely unrelated, but I saw tonight while I was prepping for this, they were showing Knicks Bulls from Christmas Day '94 on NBA TV,
Oh my God.
and I put it on, and I thought I was getting the digested version because it dropped me in with 3 seconds left in the game, and I just want to send you guys. I'll drop it in the chat because I don't know how to share my screen. Um, this moment that Steve Kerr said was the dumbest thing that he's ever done on a basketball court, and I texted my mom because my mom I know would have been watching this game. She doesn't her memory varies, and I texted her. I said, hey, do you remember this game? And I got a text, and I said I watched it, and I was like, I can probably still hear you screaming because I thought, oh, this sounds familiar. And she wrote me back and said, I can't believe you said what I was just going to say. Not only do I remember watching, but yes, I remember screaming.
Oh, that's funny.
And the moment that I put the timestamp on it is absurd. One of the great buzzer beater clutch shots you'll see.
I put at the very end of my thread too, I put just it's the toughest NBA team ever. I think it's like the 92, 93 Knicks. But I watched 30 minutes of it the other night. But it's fascinating. I mean, because you're watching it close down basketball, right? It's basketball. It's all in this like tight space of the lane and all that, but they're so fucking big. Like they are huge. Like Oakley in particular looks like a football player. Like, and it's funny because I would think that like in some ways, I mean, obviously you could like say Zion's like an aberration or whatever. And I'm not saying that they're thick necessarily, but they're all just so bulky down there. And it's just an interesting somebody else, I think Dr. Thompson on Threads had put a thing out today about would Steph still be great if he wasn't a prolific 3-point shot maker, right? And I think what came to mind for me immediately was like, could his body have held up in that 90s kind of, in the lane, getting pushed, shoved, like getting hit in the face, like I don't know, do players, and then Sunday is my podcast day. I listen to the Greatest of All Talk all the time. It's like my favorite podcast that I have. And they were talking about that on this episode as well, where they were saying like, has the 3-point revolution prolonged the careers of a lot of our favorite players, right? Like Dame is like a great example. Like if Dame had been playing 90s basketball his whole career, instead of playing way out past the 3-point line, would his body have held up, right? So it's an interesting conundrum, but I do recommend like looking at a little bit of the footage of these teams just because like they had even different body types for what their roles were. It started changing a little bit more when they got the more outside shooting and stuff like that. Like Houston and Camby are both these like long, lengthy guys, but Mace and Oak specifically are like squat, short. Larry Johnson is another one, or like you have a bunch of freaking football dudes on your team, Okay.